I've spent the last 2 days watching something unfold on the world stage that I genuinely believed I would never witness in my lifetime. And I want to speak to you tonight not from a position of political authority, but as someone who spent years inside those rooms, behind closed doors, at the tables where history either gets made or permanently broken. Because what just transpired between the United States and Canada is not a news ticker item. It is not a trade spat that fades by Tuesday morning. What just happened is one of those rare defining moments, the kind that foreign policy scholars will analyze for the next 2 decades, the kind that quietly reshapes how every government on earth recalculates its relationship with Washington. Donald Trump asked Canada for relief. I want you to pause on that. The man whose entire political architecture, his brand, his image, his identity, was constructed on the foundation of never needing anything from anyone. The man who spent nearly 2 years suggesting Canada should feel privileged to become the 51st state. The man who wrapped tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum in the language of national security. That man walked into a room and asked, and Mark Carney looked back at him, in front of the entire watching world, and said no. I did not read about the American-Canadian relationship in briefing books. I lived it from behind the desk that sits in the most consequential office on earth. When the North American Free Trade Agreement was signed in 1993, I understood what it represented, not just economically, but strategically. There were legitimate arguments on every side. Labor voices worried about displacement. Economists debated efficiency. Canadian and Mexican counterparts sat across the table trying to determine whether we were offering partnership or dominance. We chose partnership, and for 30 years, that choice held. What grew from it became the largest bilateral trading relationship in recorded history, roughly $800 billion moving across that border annually. Supply chains so deeply interwoven that assembling an American automobile requires Canadian materials, and sustaining Canadian energy requires American capital. We were not simply neighbors sharing a fence line. We were embedded in each other's economic architecture. That understanding persisted across administrations. Through disagreements, through renegotiations, through political friction, the foundational logic held: you do not dismantle a 30-year partnership over short-term positioning. Even the renegotiation that produced the USMCA in 2020 operated on that principle. It was imperfect, as all agreements are, but functional, because the people involved still understood what was at stake. Then something broke. Not all at once, not loudly. It broke the way trust always erodes, gradually, then irreversibly, tariff by tariff. Insult layered on insult. The 51st state framing that Canadians heard not as a joke, but as a declaration. The repeated suggestion that Canada was somehow exploiting the United States, that the most important trade partnership in the world was actually a bad deal. That America's closest ally was, in reality, an adversary operating in disguise. And then the moment I believe permanently altered the political atmosphere in Ottawa, the direct message, stated plainly, that Canada needed America more than America needed Canada. That sovereignty, when it conflicted with American preference, was something Washington merely tolerated. Canada heard that. Canada cataloged it. And Mark Carney, not a career politician maneuvering for advantage, but a man who ran two of the world's most significant central banks, who understands global capital flows with a precision most people reserve for their daily schedules, made a decision. He would not arrive at any negotiating table from a posture of fear. Here are the facts, because facts are what this moment demands. In early March 2026, the United States imposed 25% tariffs on Canadian goods, framed around national security and trade imbalance concerns. Canada responded with immediate retaliatory measures, targeting approximately $17 billion in American exports. Farmers in Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin felt the effects almost immediately. Dairy producers, auto parts suppliers, lumber operations, real businesses built on 3 decades of deeply integrated trade. Within weeks, the economic data arrived, and it was not favorable. Consumer prices on goods containing Canadian components began climbing. Supply chains that took generations to construct started showing visible fractures. American automotive manufacturers began issuing public warnings about production disruptions. Republican senators representing border states began making phone calls to the White House that no one there was particularly happy to receive. And then came the meeting. Trump and Carney, cameras present, the entire diplomatic world watching. What Trump communicated in that room was not a calculated negotiating posture wrapped in aggressive language. It was a request. It was an ask. He indicated he wanted a path forward, wanted tensions reduced, wanted a deal. Every trade diplomat in every capital on earth recognized immediately what that was. And Carney, with the composure of a man who has managed financial systems during genuine global crises, responded with clarity. Canada would not be absorbed. Canada would not negotiate with a threat positioned at its throat. Canada would engage as a fully equal partner, or Canada would not engage at all. The answer was no. Here is something I learned over years of sitting in that chair. When you apply maximum pressure to an ally, you are placing a specific bet. The bet is that their need for the relationship exceeds their need for self-respect. That calculation can work. I have seen it work. But it only works when the other side believes that conceding is politically survivable at home. When you publicly humiliate a partner, repeatedly, gratuitously, you fundamentally transform their domestic political situation. You make it impossible for them to give you what you want, because giving you what you want now carries the appearance of capitulation. The concession that might have been available before the humiliation becomes unavailable after it. The current administration did not simply apply pressure to Canada. It made pressure the totality of the relationship, and in doing so, it handed Mark Carney something extraordinary, a mandate. Because every Canadian who absorbed those 51st state references, every Canadian who watched their country discussed as though it were a junior administrative district, every Canadian who saw national identity treated as a tradable commodity, every one of them became political reinforcement for Carney the moment he walked into that room. He did not say no, despite political risk. He said no because the insults directed at his country had accidentally provided him the political strength to do exactly that. There is something that does not generate headlines as easily as tariff numbers and dramatic rejections, but matters just as profoundly. What this moment does to the architecture of American global leadership. The rules-based international order that the United States constructed after World War II was not an act of idealism. It was an act of strategic realism. A world governed by agreed rules, even flawed ones, is a world where American power compounds over time. Allies who trust you multiply your reach. Partners who fear you eventually find other partners. When trade disputes arose during my administration, with Japan, with the European Union, with China in its early years inside the WTO framework, we used systems, dispute resolution processes, bilateral negotiations conducted through proper institutional channels with established legal frameworks. The process was not separate from the outcome. The process was part of the outcome. What the world observed in that room with Carney was the United States attempting to substitute presidential personality for institutional strategy, and Canada declined the substitution. Consider this in terms any American would recognize. You have a business partner of 30 years. You built something together. It works. Then one day you begin telling people he is actually your employee. You make public demands. You insult him at industry gatherings. You question whether the partnership ever served you. And then, after all of that, you walk into a meeting and ask him for favorable terms because you currently need them. That partner says no, not because he cannot see the value of the relationship, but because, yes, at that point would cost him everything. That is what happened. In front of Beijing, in front of Brussels, in front of every government now quietly revising its assessment of Washington. Who benefits from this outcome strategically? China has invested 15 years attempting to persuade developing nations that American leadership is fundamentally unreliable. That argument just received a compelling demonstration at no cost to Beijing. Russia observes the strain on alliance cohesion and takes note. Every government currently weighing deeper alignment with American institutions against the pursuit of alternatives just watched Canada, a country sharing a 5,500-mile border with the United States, culturally closest to us, historically most aligned, say publicly that the relationship requires substantial repair before normal business can resume. This is not political commentary. This is the actual cost structure of the decisions being made. The American people have a right to understand it fully. Let me tell you what genuinely concerns me about where this leads. The most optimistic scenario requires the administration to quietly reduce the most aggressive tariffs, allowing Canada to return to negotiations without the optics of surrender. Markets stabilize. Disrupted supply chains begin healing. American workers caught in the middle get some relief. That outcome is possible. But it requires something this administration has not demonstrated: the capacity for quiet de-escalation, for giving ground without declaring it victory, for allowing the other side to return to the table with their dignity preserved. Because Carney cannot accept a deal that resembles capitulation any more than Trump can. The politics on both sides of that border are now locked. Reaching agreement from here requires genuine statesmanship. The more probable scenario, absent meaningful change, is a protracted economic standoff that slowly damages both sides while each absorbs costs in different ways. American businesses dependent on North American supply chains keep passing costs to consumers. Canadian businesses adapt, slowly, painfully, finding alternative markets in Europe and Southeast Asia. And here is the part that should concern every American regardless of party. Canada is quite capable of building alternative relationships when circumstances demand it. Every Canadian export dollar redirected toward other markets is a unit of leverage voluntarily surrendered by Washington. The scenario that concerns me most at a structural level is long-term strategic repositioning. Canada methodically, quietly, without drama, reducing its dependence on American markets. Not ending the relationship, but permanently diluting it. Diversifying trade partnerships, building alternative supply chains, developing domestic capacity in areas where American supply was previously treated as a given. And once that process begins in earnest, it becomes very difficult to fully reverse, regardless of what any future administration attempts. If Canada, the country most culturally proximate to us, most historically aligned, most geographically bound to us, if Canada successfully demonstrates that reducing dependence on Washington is not merely survivable, but strategically intelligent, that example becomes visible to every other government considering similar calculations. You can win a tariff confrontation and simultaneously lose the architecture of American influence. That is the real risk. But before any geopolitical analysis, there are American workers in the middle of this who did nothing to create this situation and have no power to resolve it. Auto workers in Detroit whose production lines depend on Canadian components, now subject to tariffs. Farmers in border states who built their operations around market access that is now closing. Small manufacturers who never thought about trade policy because it never reached them directly, who are now learning the difference between tariff theory and tariff reality at considerable personal cost. The worker in Toledo who cannot get a clear answer about whether his plant absorbs the costs or reduces his hours. The farmer in Minnesota who planted based on market projections that no longer exist. The small business owner who signed a supply contract 6 months ago that now puts her underwater. They deserve policy built on durable strategy rather than political performance. They deserve a North American relationship that reflects 30 years of genuine mutual benefit rather than a narrative about winners and losers that serves the moment rather than the people living inside it. What I am asking is specific. I am asking Congress to exercise its constitutional role, Trade authority in this country runs through the legislative branch. The tariffs producing this disruption were imposed through executive authority that Congress retains the power to constrain. That is not interference with foreign policy. That is the institutional check the founders built precisely for moments like this one. I am asking the administration to tell the American people what success looks like. What specific, measurable outcome ends this standoff? What is Canada required to do? What does the United States offer in return? What is the framework? Because making demands without a framework is not a negotiating strategy. It is pressure without destination. And I am asking every American to understand that trade policy is not an abstraction. It is whether the manufacturing job in your state survives the next quarter. It is whether the car you want is available at a price you can manage. It is whether the farmer in your county can sell his crop. It is immediate and personal whether or not you are following it. America's most profound strength has never been purely economic or military, though we lead in both. It is our demonstrated capacity to look at a situation clearly, acknowledge what is not working, and correct course. We have done it before, on trade, on alliances, on strategies that stopped serving us. We can do it again, but only through honesty about where we currently stand. A president asking Canada for relief and being refused on camera is not a minor diplomatic awkwardness. It is a signal about the limits of pressure without strategy, about what happens when you treat allies as adversaries long enough that they begin conducting themselves accordingly, about the distance between the performance of strength and actual strength. Real strength, the kind I observed up close for years in that office, the kind that genuinely moves the world, is not determined by who blinks first or who projects the most confidence in front of a camera. Real strength is building relationships resilient enough to survive serious disagreement. Real strength is maintaining a strategy with a longer horizon than the current news cycle. Real strength is the power that compounds across decades because the people you need are genuinely with you rather than quietly searching for alternatives. Canada just delivered information, not about Canada, about us, about what we look like from outside our own perspective right now, about the gap between our self-image and the image being formed in capitals around the world. I hope we are listening. I hope someone in Washington is sitting with what happened in that room and asking not who won the moment, but what does this mean for the next 10 years? Because those 10 years are being shaped by choices being made right now. The next decade of North American economic integration, of alliance cohesion, of American leadership credibility, it is all in motion. Let us get this right. We owe it to the workers caught in the middle of something they did not choose. We owe it to the allies watching from a careful distance. We owe it to the institutions that generations of Americans constructed so that no president would ever need to ask and no partner would ever be forced to choose between dignity and cooperation. Let us get this right. God bless the United States of America.